Hello, teachers. Welcome back to another great series with Kenneth Davis. This time, we're going to be focusing on Strongman, Kenneth's new book that came out in October of 2020. And so, we're going to be doing a series about democracy and the need to uphold democracy and what happens when democracy falls. And so, I'm here today with my friend Kenneth C. Davis, who is the author of Strongman, The Rise of Five Dictators and the Fall of Democracy. And I am Jessica Ellison. I'm a teacher educator at the Minnesota Historical Society. And we're going to be talking about five different individuals, one per episode. And we are going to start today with Mussolini. And this is episode 1, Believe, Obey, and Fight. And I've got some really compelling primary sources here on the screen. But before we dive into the primary sources, we are going to have a conversation with Ken about Mussolini. Ken, hello, how are you?
Hello, Jessica. It is great to be with you again. And we're talking about this in what should be the happiest of seasons. This is not a happy subject, of course. I have been writing and talking about history, specifically American history, for more than 30 years. Don't know much about history, came out 30 years ago. It's astonishing to me to even say that, but it's true. And what is interesting to me, in a sense, is that for most of that 30 years, I remained a fairly optimistic person about the course of history, that in spite of all the mistakes, flaws, and problems in the past, and of which there are many, that we were moving forward, both in America and in the world. My feeling in the last 10 or 15 years, however, has changed about that, especially in the past few years. And I've become a lot more pessimistic about the fate of democracy around the world and to a degree in the United States. And of course, the election that we've just came through confirmed some of those fears for me. When we talk about people having a sense of an organized coup to overturn or subvert an American presidential election, it's pretty alarming stuff. So when I wrote Strongman, The Rise of Five Dictators and the Fall of Democracy, I certainly had it in mind that democracy was in peril. I only think that that sense of peril has increased as time has gone by. So this is a very important subject where we can learn from the history, understand the past, and bring some of those lessons to bear on the present.
Absolutely. And so in talking about the earliest dictator that appears in your book, Benito Mussolini of Italy, you titled the chapter Believe, Obey, Fight. Could you talk a little bit more about that and how that was part of Mussolini's plan?
Yes, absolutely. And let me first explain that the book talks about five men principally: Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong of China, and Iraq's Saddam Hussein. Together, they are five, certainly, of the most murderous men in 20th century history and perhaps in all of history. And they're also men whose role in their countries had a great deal with what happened in America. And that's why I focused on these five men. There are certainly other strong men in history who could have been included. But these five, I think, also typify and embody so many of the aspects of the strong man. And Mussolini is a perfect example of that. Very briefly, Mussolini is first in this book because he came first. And he established some of the techniques and tactics of a strong man that would be used even by Hitler a few years after him. So Benito Mussolini is a veteran of World War I. World War I is very, very significant in the lives of many of these men. And when the war was over, Italy was in economic chaos, but it was a democracy. It was a constitutional monarchy like England. So there were elections, and Mussolini, in fact, was an elected member of the Italian legislature, the Chamber of Deputies. One year, he threatens that he's going to march his men, who were known as the Black Shirts or fascists, into Rome and take over the government. It was an empty threat. It was a bluff. He certainly didn't have enough men to do such a thing. But the king of Italy at the time, a rather feckless character, chooses to, instead of allowing this to happen, he offers Mussolini the prime ministership of Italy. Mussolini, who was his party was probably the fourth most powerful in Italy at the time, certainly grabs this chance to become the leader of Italy and very quickly moves through legal means and illegal means to consolidate the power of his party, the fascist party, into a one-party state. And their motto was believe, obey, and fight. And in a way, you can almost say this is the motto for all of these strong men: believing in this person as the single leader, obeying everything he says, and then fighting when instructed to. And that fight could mean fighting against outside powers or going to war, which Mussolini certainly did. So this was a very important idea that was part of this was carved in stone, truly in stone, around Italy. And you saw these words: believe, obey, and fight. In addition, Mussolini had, and we'll talk about his youth movement, he had children recite every day these words: Mussolini ha sempre ragione. In Italian, that means Mussolini is always right. This is the essence of creating a leader who is, we use the word cult of personality. He is the leader of the country, the single person who can solve all the country's problems. And Italy had great problems after World War I. So this is why Mussolini is included, and his history is so instructive. And he was in power for more than 2 decades in Italy, and many of the things he did influenced what Hitler was going to do in Germany a few years later.
So you mentioned the youth organization, and I think this is something that's a common thread with strongmen and dictators. So could you talk a little bit about the youth organization in Italy?
Yes, all of these men used very typical techniques to consolidate their power once they were in power. Mussolini, of course, was put into power in an elective government. He destroyed democracy. Hitler, same thing, put into power by a constitutional government, a democracy, and he quickly destroyed it. These men use a whole series of techniques. I describe it in Strongman as the strongman's playbook. One of those clearly is taking the young people of the country and putting them into groups, organized groups, that become obedient and loyal to the leader and to the party, that the state becomes the organization to which they believe and obey. In Italy, there had been youth groups, most of them organized by the church for the most part. In Germany, there had been the German equivalent of the Boy Scouts. Both Mussolini and Hitler take these groups over and turn them to their own purposes. In Italy, it was known as Balilla, Ballilla. And they took boys and girls as young, because they had a group for boys and a group for girls. And they were grouped by age, and it went from about the age of 8 up until you were an adult. And after adulthood, boys were then inducted into the military. So this was really a life completely devoted to the state. And we see this today still going on. It's not like something that happened long ago. This is exactly what happens in places like Korea, for instance, North Korea. So this is part of what many of these strong men use. And every one of the 5 men I talk about in the book does exactly the same thing: create a youth movement that is devoted and completely loyal to the party and its objectives.
So you said that Mussolini was in power for 2 decades. And subsequently destroyed democracy in Italy. How did this all end?
Well, in Mussolini's case, it ends with the war, World War II, and the ultimate defeat of Italy, which is allied with Germany. Mussolini was the man who coined the phrase the Axis. He called it the Axis of Steel between Italy and Germany, later joined by Japan. Of course, when the United States and Great Britain finally invade Italy, in the latter days of World War II. Mussolini is eventually deposed. He is then captured by partisans, that's Italians who were fighting against the Nazis and the Italians who were allied with the Nazis. And he is executed in very graphic way and very public way, hung in public upside down after he'd been machine gunned. And there's a very famous photograph of Mussolini and other fascists hanging upside down in a gas station in Milan. So he comes to a very violent end, but this was after completely consolidating his hold on Italy, as I said, for more than 20 years. He comes to power in the early 1920s, and he leads Italy right into World War II, and finally is killed in 1945. So it's a long period of Italian history, and it's a period of Italian history that's completely linked to Adolf Hitler because these two men became allies. But it's interesting because most people think of Mussolini as sort of a second fiddle to Hitler, a minor character, that Hitler was the predominant one. And that was true later on. But early on, Mussolini really provided the playbook that Hitler was going to use, this idea of a march on Rome. Hitler tried the similar thing in Munich. It didn't work out, and he was arrested and put in jail, and we'll talk about Hitler in another episode. But this is, he watched what Mussolini had done, the use of propaganda, really important for us to talk about when we talk about Strongman. The violent and brutal putting down of any opposition, the use of fraudulent elections to concentrate power. These are all techniques that Mussolini used that Hitler would replicate years later. And that's why these techniques in the Strongman's playbook are so important to understand, because we can see them happening around the world today. And to some degree, we've seen them happening in our own country in recent times.
So a final question, if you were to pinpoint a lesson that we can learn from Mussolini, what would it be?
Well, I think the overarching lesson with Mussolini, and it applies to Hitler as well, is that democracy does not die in darkness. We've heard that phrase used. The Washington Post, which I read every day, uses it on the front page of their newspaper. But the story of Mussolini shows that democracy does not die in darkness. It often is killed in broad daylight, while thousands, if not millions of people cheer. Mussolini had a program that people liked. He was getting the country back on its feet again. He was building roads and doing public works and establishing a sense that the greatness of ancient Rome and ancient Italy was being brought back to life. This is another technique that a strongman uses, recalling the greatness of the past and trying to bring it back to the present. The idea that our nation has been brought down by foreigners or immigrants or somebody that we don't like, and we must rebuild the great civilization we've had. Every one of these five men does the same, exactly the same thing. Mussolini did that, and in doing that, of course, destroyed democracy in Italy, and it took 2 decades and a world war to restore it.
Well, I think using sources from the time, including propaganda and others, really will help teachers and students grasp this, the visualness of how he was able to take over without something like social media.
That's right. Of course, there was no social media in Italy in the 1920s. In fact, most Italians were illiterate. So newspapers weren't even that significant. There were certainly newspapers and presses. Mussolini himself was a journalist. The radio hadn't really been widely established in Italy at that time, but Italians loved going to the movies. This was the beginning of the movie era. And so what Mussolini understood was the power of movies as propaganda. So there was a law in Italy passed under the fascists that every movie that was shown had to be preceded by a newsreel that was produced by the fascist party. And those newsreels often featured Mussolini marching in front of a cheering crowd, riding a horse bare-chested, which actually Vladimir Putin has also done. So it's very, a modern strongman looking back to more than 100 years ago, and Mussolini using these images of himself as this strong kind of macho, super masculine figure who was the father figure for the country and a model of strength and virility. And that's a very, very important piece of the cult of personality. So the propaganda, the cult of personality, the loyalty to the state, the loyalty to the leader, all come together, and propaganda is key to that. And you don't need social media to do it if you know how to keep putting those messages out there. And Mussolini's face was everywhere, just as Hitler's was, and later on Mao Zedong's face was everywhere, often smiling as the beneficent leader, the father figure for the country.
Well, on that note, let's take a look at some primary sources showing exactly that, and take a look at how we can talk with our students about these messages. So the photograph that you see here is of Mussolini, who's standing in the center, looking very angry or very stern, or we could, have students come up with what emotions do you see coming out of not only Mussolini, but all of the people surrounding him in this photograph. I mean, if you look in the back, there's a child, looks like somebody has them on their shoulders, and the child looks very peaceful. So this is a really great image to dig into with students, to look at this kind of cult of personality. And then the other image you see here is a piece of propaganda that was used in schools. It was the cover of a notebook that students were required to use. They had to use these notebooks with pictures of Mussolini and quotes from Mussolini on them and in them. You can see on the sides, very slender, the staples that hold it together. And so I think an interesting activity with these types of sources, photographs and propaganda, is to do an observe, think, wonder, which is always a great way to start with primary sources. What do you see? What do you think? What do you wonder? But I would like to tweak it a little bit. Observe, think, feel. When you look at these images, what do you feel? And what do you think that people felt at the time when they were looking at these? And that really gets to a lot of the Strongman playbook that Ken was talking about, and the way that people built their loyalty to this individual and to the government. So how did they feel? So there's a lot of great resources that you can dive into, and what I would like you to do is take a look at these, and then also there's other primary sources and resources available at this link, bit.ly/S Strongman 2020. And if you have any questions, please do feel free to send me an email at jessica.ellison@mnhs.org. So thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you for the next episode.